We're going to talk today about e-commerce. Actually, we're not going to talk so much about e-commerce. We're going to talk today about retail. And, among the disruptions, if you will, that this conference is dealing with and thinking about the future of urbanism and the future of cities is the way e-commerce is changing retail and what it means for places in which the ground plane and the experience of the public space, a lot of which is retail, is changing. I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves in a minute. We're a panel of practitioners, so I think it'll be a little bit of a different flavor, and we're just going to try to have a good time and kind of talk about how we think this sort of evolving economy kind of creates opportunities for great cities, opportunities for people in business and the like. So Phil, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure, yeah, so thanks everybody for having us. I'm Phil Bretsch with Regency Centers. We're a national owner, operator, developer of primarily retail and mixed-use properties throughout the U.S. My role is development acquisitions in the Pacific Northwest, so have a few active retail developments now and can share some anecdotes.
Great. Noel?
Yeah, and I'm Noel Johnson, developer primarily in Portland, the metropolitan area, a little bit in Seattle. Not so much, historically I was in the institutional space, and more recently this economic cycle or real estate cycle I've been more the classic individual developer. So you kind of have the perspective both here of, developers are kind of weird. If you can spell it right and go to Kinko's and get a business card for yourself, you can be a developer. But if I can bifurcate that, a lot of it is institutional capital and larger company, and then a lot of it is small individual entrepreneur, local developer. So you have a little bit of both of that with us here today.
Good. So here's what we've kind of talked about doing this morning. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on, right? What is the state of retail and how is it changing or not changing? We're going to talk a bit more broadly about how this is playing out in different parts of the region, in different parts of our cities, in different parts of the industry. We're going to talk about suburbs as well as cities, which is something we kind of overlook. And then we're going to talk about, what as retail practitioners you're doing and kind of get some perspective on what, cities and counties and other sort of public agencies that are sort of dealing with this change maybe should be doing in the context of sort of remaining vibrant. So maybe we'll sort of start with, facts on the ground. You guys are kind of unapologetically retail developers, owner-operators. You haven't hung up your hat and gone to work for Amazon.
Right, right.
So where are we if this is in fact a disruptive force in American life?
I mean, it's fascinating. You mentioned Amazon, and you take Amazon and Alibaba, and they're basically 2% of global GDP, right? So that would be a classic retail. I mean, that's a big number, right? To be 2% of the globe, that's like the pharaohs and other historical kings and things like that. So we are in this crazy gilded age that the world sort of cycles through periodically. And so from my perspective, with respect to just being a retail developer, it's almost, it's like, to be honest, I have no idea where we are, right? Because this is so fast. The pace of change is changing so quickly, sort of that Thomas Friedman article that his most recent book makes very eloquently. And of course, then you push that against the rub that is real estate, which gets developed very slowly, is built for 100 years,
right.
Theoretically. And so you've got the fastest against the slowest, and what the heck do we do now? It's kind of a really fun, interesting moment.
Yeah. Phil?
Yeah, so along those lines, I mean, certainly e-commerce is a disruptor. I mean, we talk about it at our company all the time. We're thinking about it. It's the big thing out there, and it's really hard to get your arms around. What does it mean? Now, you see Wall Street Journal articles in the Forbes that says retail's dead, 7,000 stores closing, all these things. I mean, when you really look at it, like you were saying, percentages, we're saying 10% today maybe is e-commerce, and that's really, there's a handful of buckets within that 10%. Looked at some charts from ICSC which show, shipping and handling's in there. Omni-channel for, if you buy something from Macy's on Macy's.com, that's going to be in there. But that doesn't necessarily hurt Macy's or that retail. And then you look at what's the pure play, what's pulling away from the retail properties. And that's something like about a third of it looks like. Now, it's growing fast, so we got to, be mindful of that. So that's one thing where, hey, still 9 out of every $10 is spent in 4 walls. But things are changing rapidly, and you have to look at the different segments of retail. When people think retail, they think big box department stores where you can go buy a t-shirt and paper towels. Well, there's also restaurants. There's also service providers, barbershops, and each one is impacted differently and has to adapt and pivot differently.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good way to kind of go through this kind of piece by piece. Suburban big box retail, arguably the most disrupted at the moment. Is that the way you guys see that in your business?
Yeah, I mean, Phil's got a great, probably better perspective on that than me, but I think it's really important to mention the verticals, right? Where you've got grocery, that's only a couple % penetrated by e-commerce, versus apparel or other elements that is 30, 40, 50% penetrated by e-commerce. And so, as is true with most things, the minute we start generalizing, we're more inaccurate, or we create more confusion than we're helpful. And so, if you take sort of what is the $20 to $25 trillion market that is retail, as like a Goldman Sachs kind of would look at, retail world and investing in, that's a huge world, right? Trillion. And so we got to be very specific maybe about where this is happening, because some areas, massive change, right? And other areas, we really haven't seen it yet. Doesn't mean it won't happen. But the Suburban Big Box is a great example of what's happening right now.
Yeah, I think that's, and it's obvious. Those are the ones that are closing stores. Those are the ones that are kind of hanging on. You see the stock values being hit. And like Noel just said, the spectrum there. I mean, on one end of it, it's these soft goods or Blockbuster, right? They're not going to make a comeback. But on the other end, there's the ones that, hey, like, your bowling alleys that are in these things. You can't necessarily duplicate that online, but they better get engaged in e-commerce to remain relevant and beat out their competition.
Yeah.
So, it's the whole spectrum.
But what I hear you guys saying is that sort of suburban big box, particularly in the markets that have a lot of it, that is in the process of maybe being disrupted, right? That's not coming back. That's not kind of immune from the further kind of capture of e-commerce.
Well, even, I promised, we were joking as we were preparing for the panel, that we try and be lively and give each other grief. So I'm going to give Phil grief right now, where, Phil's not, and we're not the oldest guys in the room here, but Phil, for example, has already advocated for the purchase of a Blockbuster building. Remember that? A long time ago?
No, I advocated for the sale of it.
Yeah, well, that's right, because it happened so fast, right? Because it's just a good example of what at one moment seemed like a really good idea, whatever it was, 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, instantly, it was a really bad idea, and how fast can you move, right? And so within the real estate investment world, that's just a good example, right?
Yeah.
Where you're like, holy tamale.
Yeah, and I think where that, if we could move a little bit from retail to the retail investment and property ownership, is that we work together, so we're talking about a specific property out in a third ring suburb. Now, if you owned a Blockbuster in downtown Portland on a hard corner in a quarter block, hey, maybe that retailer doesn't survive, but that's a great investment.
Right.
So that's where the fundamentals really come into play, and probably some of what we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
Yep.
So one of you mentioned grocery. What do you sort of see as changing as owners of retail center? People are probably curious to get a take on, what does it mean, Amazon's acquisitions of Whole Foods? What is sort of the facts on the ground? Begin to sort of tell us about how grocery changes over time.
Well, I mean, I don't know if any of you caught the New York Times last week, I think it was, article where they actually had a nice article about the Amazonification of Whole Foods, right? And there's a lot in there. They're trying to change it from whole paycheck to a more normal, understood, accepted by the market example. But what I found really fascinating is that they were using the bricks and mortar location to help put their hardware, right? Amazon's never really, it's not like Apple, that, they've never really excelled in hardware. They put their hardware there because there is this element that if you're wanting to actually, figure out the piece of hardware, sometimes it's kind of nice to touch it, look at it, have the person explain to you how to work it, because the internet just doesn't help you understand how much that piece of hardware might change your life. And Apple figured that out really early, right? And now 90+% of us have this within our grasp 24 hours a day. I think that's a fact. But I think the Amazon acquisition of Whole Foods is an illustration of how the retail will be doing and sort of creating opportunities for innovation where Amazon can continue to grow their service, grow their quality of delivery. It's actually a node of innovation for these traditional retail and or the new retail moments. Who will innovate is the question.
Phil, what's Regency's sense of kind of the grocery business where you see it?
Sure. Well, we're huge proponents of the grocery business. That's the majority of what we do, grocery anchored shopping centers. But there's changes.
Right.
I think one is, we kind of talked about this on the phone before, is what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Well, it's also interesting to look what was happening 10 years ago and how things change today. And I think one real easy example is just the size of the stores.
Right.
I mean, your typical grocery store 10, 15 years ago was probably 60,000 square feet. Today, you're seeing 25,000 square feet. You're seeing Targets do 25,000 square feet. So, and then it's why. Well, I think part of what Noel was mentioning is where Amazon's kind of making the move from e-commerce to bricks and mortar, and then leveraging those two platforms really well, and, and multiple other platforms they have.
Right.
You're seeing the grocery and the tenants that were typically only bricks and mortar, transitioning and using some of this e-commerce, the data, the intelligence that you can gather to be more efficient. Some of the stuff that, hey, the donut of the store where they sell their prepared foods and all those sorts of things, the high margin stuff can still be there, but you don't need as many types of dog food or toilet paper or whatever that you can buy from Amazon easily. So they're shrinking down, they're able to meet the market, use that data and intelligence to know what people want there and get more efficient.
And that goes to just being a good operator, right? Like in terms of data. So one of the amazing things of the technology that we're talking about here today, be it sharing economy or mobility or e-commerce, it's all driven by data, massive reams of data. Well, the lovable shopkeeper down your street pretty much has data in his gut, and often that is phenomenally powerful, and the better operators really know that. But who is going to be data driven within the retail and who is not, and who can actually kind of parse that is I think that's the bifurcating element that going forward, all of a sudden someone like Phil on a national level or me on a local level, as I'm trying to figure out, okay, I'm going to develop this project. I just had a project that finished with a grocery anchored element in it. It literally is in lease up right now, and that was a 40,000 square foot grocery, which when we were doing it seemed a little small, but okay, and all of a sudden now Phil's telling me that's a little big, right? Just in the time that it took to build the project. And so that goes to data and the importance of it.
It's a good point. In some ways, the thing that sort of is most disrupted is the very uniformity of the sector, right? It used to be like it was an innovation that the grocery store went from 50,000 feet to 60,000 square feet. And, now we find that the sort of standard model doesn't work at all, right? Suburbs are over-retailed, cities are under-retailed, the boxes are too big in this spot and too small in that spot, and the model is much more fluid, which I guess sort of creates opportunity for people that are kind of trying to respond to it.
I think that's right. And we talk about equity and like how does that fit into it? There's a huge amount of opportunity in this dislocation, right? Because as we walk up and down the high streets of any global city in any part of the world, there's sort of this disappointment increasingly where it's all the same stores, right? And you lose that sort of sense of culture. And think of your favorite cities like 10 years ago or 15 years ago as you travel to today. Well, that, I think, is really quickly going to change back to what we used to have, right? Because the value of a high street, quote unquote, was entertainment and experience. And that is coming back in spades as to what is the value. And we talk about it with power centers or something, and like the element of just putting a Red Robin in a power center, that doesn't get you there, right? But that's kind of the best solution that so many right now have. And so we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've talked a bunch today about, or other folks have sort of mentioned the suburbanization of poverty. Mm-hmm. And, one of the other things that we observe as a sort of changing dynamics in suburbs, but cities too, is the suburbanization of ethnicity. Yeah. In your travel, and one of the things that we see is kind of an increasing sort of sensitivity and nuance to different ethnic communities in terms of the character and kind of retail that serves them. Do you guys in your business sort of begin to think about, pockets of ethnicity and how to serve those groups with different kinds of retail, in a way, another sort of disruption of the kind of conventional monolithic retail model?
Yeah, I could just touch on, some of our experiences is, we, with really any project that we take on, we're really letting the market, being the local, regional area help dictate, because we want to come and meet that market. So, that could be in terms of layout, size, tenant mix, grocer. You have a handful that, maybe one is not always the right answer. Sometimes, a certain grocer, whether it be high-end, middle-end, value play, is going to be a better fit for that market. So, that's pretty general and broad, but that's the way that we look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is, I would add to that, a historical element, right? We all have to live down our predecessors' actions. And so historically, where disenfranchisement was occurring multiple ways, and still is today, obviously, but through not listening to the local community and sort of from an outside top-down approach saying, here's what's going to happen, right? That is what I'm, as a local developer, greeted with whenever I'm proposing a new element to the built environment, okay? And the irony is that I now all the more need that local ethnic, that local cultural element to stay and to fuel, because what happens is if it gets displaced, it becomes vanilla and bland, and all I have left is the gap. And that's fine, but that's not going to create that sort of experience, that's not going to create the identity that people are seeking now in their commerce activities. So when I buy, I'm not just buying a service, a good anymore, because e-commerce has changed that paradigm. I'm now trying to identify who I am by what I buy, and that's that desiloizing, and so it comes through in retail, where I need those persons, but there's no trust. And so that's this sort of human evolution element that needs to be considered, because that's what's really hard.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so now we're starting to transition into kind of what is working in terms of Groundplay Experiences. Some of the themes that have come up already of this idea of differentiated, non-vanilla, kind of customized or kind of true to its place, as well as experience-based. Phil, what are you guys sort of doing in terms of thinking about what works, what sort of is meaningful today?
Yeah.
What's the secret sauce?
Well, and you kind of nailed it. I mean, it's, the experience. You look at, again, in historical retail centers, you remember the big Kmart's with the, mile-long sidewalk in front of shops and a big sea of parking. Nobody's getting excited about that. And that can all be easily replaced via Amazon or e-commerce or something. There's no reason to go there other than to go get your good. What we try to do now is we're trying, and you hear a lot of developers saying this, is creating this sense of place, a place where people want to come, they want to connect, a town center, something where, you can't replicate that in the e-commerce world, or you can try it through Instagram and Facebook, but it's not as, it's not as good as being there and going and having a, dinner and a drink with a friend, or, some more other sort of experience. So what we're trying to do is create these places. It comes a lot of different forms, and some of that is the tenants you choose. It's the, it's the design of the center, those sorts of things.
And I've seen some of the things that you guys have been doing, which I think is particularly interesting in suburban contexts, right? You're sort of trying to replicate what Noel called kind of that high street experience. And how do you do that? How do the economics work if you're kind of, spending money on stuff that's fun but doesn't necessarily pay rent?
Yeah, how do you do it? Very carefully. No, it's exactly that. It's trying to, because that's what some of what we talked about is, there's a flight to urban with, investment and even where tenants want to be. But there's still suburban locations that are fantastic. Great opportunities with communities of people that want those goods and services. And so it certainly is a balancing act with, you have to create something that's going to be great, that's going to help, just nuts and bolts of it, drive sales, to be able to have the tenants pay those rents, to be able to support the cost of doing it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of that circular program there, but without that, it's not going to last for the next 20 years. So
yeah, I would just add to that there's a really interesting flip that is happening, and it goes again to mindsets where traditionally the retail model was you'd have these large anchors, and they would essentially be subsidized.
Right.
They'd pay the low rent because they're going to draw all the people, right? And then the small guys around them are essentially paying to be close to those guys. But now it's 100% flipped, right? So do you want, like I don't have shareholders, so I can say a little bit more. Do you want Sears? Do you want JCPenney? Like that's a liability in your retail center. It's not something that you subsidize anymore. But you've got 20 and 30, 40-year leases that you have to manage with these guys. And they're actually very smart people, but there's such a imagine that, like your entire business structure is predicated off of being subsidized by smaller businesses, by how much you bring people there. And now you have to pay a premium just to get yourself where you need to be. And you're probably not where you need to be anymore because human preferences have shifted, mobility has shifted, right? Like it used to be retail is location, location, location. Well, think about the last panel. Where is the right location anymore?
Yeah.
It's not at the hard corner, because where is the hard corner? And like it's right in, right out. I mean, all these fundamentals of how humans moved are flipping. And so if you are these large retailers, what do you do now? It's the most crazy thing. A lot of smart people there. I don't think there's a clear answer. In the meantime, a lot of the small, local, really bespoke, really flexible, creative operators are eating their lunch, right? And because they're given so much more to the consumer, to the e-commerce sort of omni-channel sort of ideas, and so there's a real bifurcation again.
So we're kind of talking about the evolution of suburban retail in particular at the moment. You know, you have lunch with mayor of suburban county X, and this topic comes up of, we're kind of nervous, right? E-commerce, we sort of see more dark stores. In America, it is absolutely the case that a lot of our communities are over-retailed. What advice would you give, folks in the public sector thinking about how to make retail vibrant and sustainable, kind of in more suburban settings in particular? By the way, not an easy question.
Well, I mean, for example, there's a lot of architects and planners in the room, right? So typically you're hired first by that jurisdiction to help them vision and things. And then it comes to someone like me, and it's always like, type 5, type 3, whatever, it's some housing over retail. Well, that's fundamentally ignoring everything we're going to talk about here today, right? Because we've, in Portland, for example, because we have active use ground floor standards, you basically have an inclusionary zoning for retail over the past decades type policy. So we have an oversupply of retail,
right.
A. And B, now you're going to go to the suburban areas where you've got massive retail on these hard corners that are actually better corners. They are like in and out, better dynamics. And you're going to still add more retail.
Yeah.
And yet, like, you're building in a higher density close to transit, so that's good, but it's a higher cost per unit of housing. So the economics are getting worse and worse, but I honestly get from the architects these documents every single time, and by the time you've framed the mindset of the stakeholder groups, that this is what you want, the gig's up, right? So I don't respond to that because all I'm going to do is tell them things they don't want to hear.
Right.
So that is one element. Like, we need to stop doing that and help them understand that maybe density in a different way is a good idea.
Yeah. It's sort of an unwinnable discussion, right? Because, the retail tax is the sort of juice that keeps communities going.
It's done.
And, the idea that, it's not only is it just too much retail, but it's retail that's sometimes in the wrong format, in the wrong location, and it's going to sort of need to be sort of reinvented, but not necessarily with more net sales activity. It's just a tough conversation to have.
Yeah, and I think Noel hit it. I don't have too much more to add other than, within those cities, there's going to be a handful of retail centers, and I think some of it happens organically. The retail centers, if all of them are thriving, it's hard to say that's over-retailed, right? Now, if one's failing and the other two are thriving, well, hey, let's start looking at that. Why is that really a retail spot? Mm-hmm. And then I think from there, and this is probably just, because I love this, is then more flexibility to be able to, pivot quickly as an owner or, operator there to where you can go make the changes and bring back some vibrancy to that either through a full-scale redevelopment or, from small changes.
Yeah. We kind of get the question so often, there's these aging retail assets in kind of good or emerging locations. Why aren't they redeveloped and repositioned, more easily than they are? And the truth is the economics are very difficult. Do you kind of, get that pressure in your business? Why isn't it not so easy to do?
Doing that right now.
You know, this is the sort of proverbial missing
Phil-
middle, you know,
no, I
you're
mean,
like,
Phil's got that right now, right? You're fighting that sort of redevelopment. I mean, we look at all, like, think of in Denver, the Belmar redevelopment, I don't know if you know that, or, you know, you can look at everywhere. What the challenge is that it comes down to land value. And it's land value not so much even just with the base kind of thinking about what the dirt is, but these assets often have sort of vested rights for X number of trips. Okay, because we've got such massive transportation development impact fees because we can't tax, so we start doing, you know, all these sorts of things in fees to supplement our systems. So these assets are not worth the real estate, like the vertical improvements. They're a liability because it's just the cost of demo. And then even the dirt is often not really worth anything. What's really worth something is the right that you have to put like 5,000 trips per day into the system right there in that node. And so then the question is, can you translate that right from a use perspective, right? You go to the planning department and they're like, well, you've got a retail right, but I don't know if you've got a right to do that with housing. And I'm like, it's the same car, it's the same walker, it's the same bike. And in fact, I can do it better because look at how we can shift our usage, right? And it makes everyone better. And they're sitting there going, geez, there's no code here written that lets me do this. These are smart bureaucrats. They got no support politically or in the code, you know, sort of technically to be able to effectuate that change. And so you got tons of retail assets hung up for that bureaucratic, frictional reason.
right, right.
That's just one example, yeah.
So we've been talking, you know, a bit about, you know, the suburbs and some of the challenges, but, you know, sort of center cities and real high street environments almost have the opposite phenomenon, right? You know, skyrocketing rents, very, very vibrant, you know, and seemingly not very much sort of, you know, disrupted or even sort of challenged by the phenomenon of e-commerce at all. Do you know, is there gas in the can, do you think, in terms of the sort of retail energy, the sort of driving kind of, you know, urban revitalization, urban renaissance, and kind of particularly in denser settings?
Well, you know, I think for us, certainly, like you said, urban, you know, retail opportunities can be really vibrant. I think the hard part is that you're competing against a lot of other players, right? I mean, do a lot of work in Seattle, and funny enough, Amazon makes retail development difficult, not only because of the e-commerce and paying the rents, but because they are taking all the space. They're building all the office buildings, they're taking all the general contractors, and so it's making it really difficult to pencil. And those rents, even when you push them up, you know, it's still tough. So, you know, when we can find great urban opportunities, we're all over them. And then sometimes we're running up against the issues Noel mentioned where, you know, hey, in order to make this pencil when we're competing against all these other things, there's some other things we need that are not necessarily available. And it just takes a long time.
Right. By the way, if there's folks with questions, we're going to kind of come up against our time slot in a minute. But thoughts on kind of the, you know, and this sort of ties to AV, which has been one of the themes of the day. Thoughts on kind of the blurring between conventional retail and then, you know, true e-commerce that's shipped to your door and sort of like, you know, last mile mobile pop-up kind of more kind of tweener kinds of sort of retail experiences. As business people, do you sort of see opportunity there? Are you thinking about how to kind of play in that space?
Go ahead.
Well, you know, that question, for example, is in terms of where you're going to invest to play that. So Prologis, right, the largest industrial REIT out there, their biggest exposure, concentration-wise, is to Amazon because they're building millions of square foot. So when you own an industrial REIT, it turns out you're owning a retail REIT, or you have retail exposure, or, you know, I don't even know. So to that point, when I'm putting in sort of mobility shifts, I guess maybe I want to have sort of some nexus where, like, I've got this lifestyle identity opportunity where people want to be, so I'm giving them an experience, but it somehow dovetails into mobility movements between where Prologis is building that Amazon center, because that's the critical link, and it's no longer like the freeway where the off-ramp. And so, like, I haven't figured this out, but there's something that is really a broken silo that is as opposed to like different verticals, there's a horizontal strategy play that will ultimately win, but things are changing so fast that I can't figure it out, let alone convince my pension that are the investors to figure it out, right?
Yeah. And I think that, one of the answers is that we don't really know, right? Restaurant, which used to be the most inflexible retail type of all, there's now restaurant and pop-up restaurant and, delivery and food truck, so the sort of like the model is more disruptive than ever. With, by the way, the seeming instance being that the more, more variety there is in the delivery mechanism, the more demand for the product that there is.
Right, and the challenge again goes back to the fact that, like, for me, of over $900 million of total investment in my life, the majority of that equity, the risk capital, has come from pensions that are public, like CalSTRS type money, right? That's who's taking this risk out there and is building our cities, and so it's actually like, how do we make the legitimate fiduciary case that like there's a lot of public, like, that your retirement should make this shift, and it comes down to, like, well, I don't know, let's go stay with the higher parking ratio, even though we know it's wrong, but, like, can you really not? And so, like, that's this friction, this tension.
Parking is an interesting topic that we probably won't get to today. A question over here.
Hi, my name's Thomas Small. I'm the vice mayor in Culver City, California.
Mm-hmm.
We have two major properties that are owned by Regency, and we just went through a long negotiation on one of them that's being developed now. It's a very interesting project. It's a market hall, kind of an Italy or a ferry building. But the problem was the difficulty, part of why it went on so long and has been such a struggle and why we're still worried about it, is that Regency was so locked in to their formulas as to how it should be developed and exactly what the parking ratios should be, that if they didn't have the parking right outside the door of the smaller building, that it wouldn't pencil for them. So the architecture kept getting watered down. We're building a really kind of a giant parking structure for the neighborhood, to where now it almost looks like it's a parking structure with a little market hall attached. So the developer kind of teamed up with the NIMBYs in the neighborhood to demand all that parking, and it just sort of flew in the face against what we've heard in the earlier panels today and what you often hear at these conferences.
Right.
So
Well,
I guess
I'm going to reframe the question if I could, because I think what the question is about is really like this tension. We can talk about what's changing over the next 10 or 20 years, but you guys need to collect rent tomorrow,
Yeah,
right?
the answer is just what I was trying to say there, right? Like, there's, Phil's in a tough spot.
So
I can't say.
my question is, from the leadership in the city, how can I help you guys better? How can I encourage you to be a little bit more adventurous than you seem to be able to be on, with your national standards? The next property that's coming up, the Culver Center, is a big property with just like what you just described, with a Best Buy and a Ralph's that have these long leases. We would love to have housing there. So how can we work together better?
Sure, well, I can, I didn't personally work on that project, so I don't know all the ins and outs, although I am familiar with it slightly. I guess the only thing I could give, and this is just me personally, not Regency Centers. We've got projects in Seattle and Portland, and we're always looking forward. We're always thinking with an eye towards the future, because we're holding for the long haul, right? Like a lot of people do. There's a lot of developers out there that are not just buying and flipping. And we want something to be successful and vibrant 10, 15, 20 years from now. I think where the rub is, and this is something we're trying to figure out all the time, is, and like Noel mentioned, it also has to be successful today. And a lot of what I do that's driven by retailers, they're really forward-thinking, cutting-edge e-commerce type folks, but they say, hey, if we don't have this parking count, we're not going to come. And so it's, how do you balance that between having something that's successful today and getting the tenants that everybody wants, with something that's going to be flexible and have an opportunity in the future to be great. Yeah. So it doesn't answer your specific question on that property, but that's just kind of the struggle.
But maybe the framework is risk sharing, right?
Yeah, that's it.
I know nothing about this, but I'm sure Regency was, processing in as sophisticated a way as possible, what amount of risk are they able to take? And the city should be asking that question too. Well, right, I think cities are correct to take risk and to think about what they can do to sort of take the risk off of their partners. But somehow this sort of what works today and what works tomorrow needs to be bridged.
Yeah, even like a super specific example. So that parking structure is needed today, but you know it might not be needed tomorrow. Well, it's going to be 9-foot floor to floor in terms of how it's built. The city probably long-term needs it to be 12 or something, because then you can retrofit it to be housing or office later on. And you know that's where it's going. You can't ask the current investors that are at Regency or someone else to pay that extra increment, because they're not going to get that value, but the city will. So can the city somehow come in and say, well, looks like that much more concrete to build that little bit taller, and now we know, and we've zoned it, and we've figured out the transport, and we've approved the transportation, yada, yada, in such a way that we've not cornered ourselves for your successors, right? So that you can actually have what no one knows. You don't say this politically, but you can actually have a 130,000 square foot housing project that's just not yet housing, right? That would be awesome. And that's sort of like a little bit, we all in this room need to work together to get there, where we don't really tell people what we're doing. We tell them they're going to win right now, but really what we know is we're future-proofing the thing.
We're gonna have to.
That's
we're
a
gonna
good
take
answer.
couple,
Thank
one more
you.
question? One more question over here. Yeah.
Thanks. I was wondering on the intersection and convergence of mobility and e-commerce, if you guys could talk about, there's a kind of a rise of today, like Lyft is offering rewards, or Seated app is offering rewards for Lyft if you book and go to the restaurant. So can you speak to any of the business models or plans that you're hearing from retail, if they're factoring in digital rewards to help people move across the city, or is that something that's not come up yet?
Well, I think you're seeing a little bit, it's a broad question, but I hear what you're saying. Like, for example, I deal with a lot of local sort of food-based, and what's interestingly right now is that the kitchens are undersized relative to the need, okay? Because all this mobility now and the congestion now means that, especially in the affluent areas with the haves, because we've got this massively growing Gini coefficient, they're just saying, to heck with it, I'll pay to get that awesome food. So we need to find new ways to let that retail experience still occur, because you want to go there every other or every third time, but then, how do we get that food and that retail and that kitchen in like a sub-basement in a different, cheaper real estate, maybe in the parking garage that we got in Culver, and Uber or a Lyft or whatever mobility is going to be a critical link in making something like that actually work, because that's sort of like a, win-win if we can get there.
Yeah, for another topic today, there is an interesting link between food and mobility.
Oh, for sure.
Right. In the sort of cities of the future, food will be moving around cities in sort of very different ways than the typical kind of like long line to the restaurant kitchen.
Just from like how much food we waste,
Right.
right? Like food wastage relative to mobility is a critical linkage.
Well, we're out of time, but this was terrific. Thanks, guys, for doing it. Thank you for the audience for being involved.